Good morning. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. My name is Gina Davis, and I am the Education Program Specialist with Maryland's Department of Labor. Today we're here to hear a presentation from Jesse Schneiderman from Strong City. His presentation, Creating a Culturally Nourishing Curriculum. You'll notice in your control panel that you only have access to a questions panel in order to ask anything. If you have any difficulties or responses throughout the presentations, look for that questions panel. I know some things will not be a question, but you can introduce yourself in the questions panel so we can see who's here today. And just to get started, I'm going to launch a poll so we can see what the roles are of people who are participating in our presentation today. So take a moment to finish this poll for me. And I apologize in advance if you hear little noises or a tiny person's voice. My daughter is with us today. So I'm going to close the poll and share. So it looks like today we have a number of different people, instructors, program administrators, instructional specialists. So welcome and thank you guys so much for joining us today. So Jesse, without further ado, I'll kick it over to you.
For sure. So hey, everybody. Like Gina said, I'm Jesse Schneiderman. I'm the Executive Director of the Adult Learning Center. We are a program of Strong City, Baltimore. So we do both ELA and ABE for free in Baltimore, in East Baltimore. And so I'm going to talk what it looks like to create a culturally nourishing curriculum for your adult education program, which can sometimes be a little bit more difficult because we are so test-based in adult ed, but that's what we're going to talk about. I have a couple of questions that are going to come up in the presentation. Again, just answer those in the question box as they come, and I'll talk about them as I see. Similarly to Gina, who apologized for her child potentially making some noise, my dog is sitting next to me. She may make some noise as well. So please bear with me. So we're going to talk about creating a culturally nourishing curriculum today. So let's get started. So first question, obviously, that we have to consider when we're talking about a culturally nourishing curriculum is what is culture, right? We need to know what culture means before we could talk about what it means to create a culturally nourishing curriculum. So what are some elements, and I'm going to ask that we answer this in that same question box. What are some things that could be considered someone's culture? What are some elements of a person's personality or a person's history that can be considered their culture? And we can just answer those right in that question box. I see language, which absolutely involves someone's culture. Anything else? Thank you, Deborah Miller. Again, we're just typing in the question box with an answer. I see, oh, I missed a whole bunch. How they greet people, how they define themselves, where they grew up, language or rituals, beliefs, traditions, beliefs and values, socialization, lots of things. Really great. Thank you, everybody, for sharing. The point is, and the point of asking this, is that a lot of things make up culture, right? You can't just say, oh, this is their culture, right? A lot of the time when K-12 education talks about cultural curriculum, they talk about race. And that's not the only thing. And that's kind of what I'm getting at here. There's a lot of things that make up culture. So there's two terms that I want us to talk about before we start, and that's culturally responsive teaching or culturally sustaining teaching. And I think I'm going to put the poll up. Oh, no, not. But thank you for putting it up. So if you've heard of either of these terms or you haven't heard of either of these terms before, you just vote because I want to see where we're coming from here. I believe you can answer, you can pick as many as you want. So these results are about what I expected. Take a couple more seconds to vote if you have not already. Yeah, this is basically what I expected to see. So as we're finishing up, it looks like about 70% of us have heard of culturally responsive, which is true, right? Culturally responsive teaching is something that is, it's a buzzword, but it also means something real. Folks have taken it a step further to talk about culturally sustaining teaching, which is obviously a very important thing that is a little bit different. And then finally, when we talk about, some of us have not heard of either of them, which is totally fine. And as we share the results, you see what I was getting at. 69% have heard of culturally responsive, 24 have heard of culturally sustaining, 31% haven't heard of either of them. And that's not particularly surprising. That's kind of what I was expecting. So today we're going to talk about about the differences between them and how we take it a step further to be culturally nourishing. And so when we look at this, what we have to base this in, first of all, is the research, right? When you look at research, there's two elements that really show how we build culturally sustaining andragogy. The first thing we have to do is celebrate the differences in our students, make an actual effort to talk about the differences in our students and to work with the differences of our students, right? And the next thing is that our curriculum, our materials, our teaching styles, all of that has to do with what culturally sustaining teaching looks like and what culturally nourishing teaching looks like. So let's keep it moving. I want to talk about that a little bit, but I see a couple of issues with the polls, but if you could just mention them here, it's totally fine. So let's keep it moving. So before we start, let's look at adult learners. We all know about andragogy, that's our job, but obviously there's 5 characteristics that make adult learners with 5 things that are really important to consider with adult learners. We have to assume that there is a higher self-concept than when we're talking about K-12. We have to realize that adult learners have different experiences and that they want their experiences met and talked about and appreciated. And that's kind of partially about culture as well, right? If we are talking about the learners' experiences, what they've been through and what they've gone through, that's really going to show that we are listening to our students and their experiences. We are going to assume that they're ready to learn, right? They are a little more ready to learn and they're a little more oriented to learning, specifically when we're comparing them to K-12 students. And when we're talking, finally, motivation to learn, the motivation to learn is a little more internal, a little less external. So with kids, for anyone with experience teaching kids, you need to kind of externally motivate them, through rewards or something like that. We can assume adult learners are a little more internally motivated. It's not always true. Nothing is ever true for everybody, but it's something to consider. So let's get into the actual legitimate bits about how to build a culturally nourishing curriculum. So there's 5 steps, and this is based on research by Anici and Butler and a number of other people. I really like their research because they divided it into 5 steps, but other researchers have determined that the same kind of steps, they just may have named them slightly differently. So we're going to dive really deep into all 5 of these steps, so don't feel like you have to take everything right now. The first is to acquire knowledge about the cultural diversity in your classroom or course, and you have to self-assess your own biases. And I'm going to tell a story about that in a little bit. Step 2 is speaking to your students, right? Nobody knows the cultural diversity of your course, of your classroom, of your program better than your adult learners. Your adult learners can tell you how they are diverse. And that's how you're going to get that information. They may not want to tell you specifically, but there's ways to get that information. Then you use that knowledge to adjust your instructional practices. And again, this is all based on what we think people want to do and how we think folks want to learn. And again, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. The next step is to examine your classroom materials. That's really hard for adult ed, again, because we're so test-based, but there are ways to change your classroom materials from being one way to being culturally nourishing. And finally, you're going to implement it. Once you've done all these things, now you're implementing culturally nourishing curriculum. So before I move on, I just want to make sure, is there any questions before we move on? Just type them in the question box. I'm not necessarily sure you can see everybody else's questions, but I can. So if there are any questions before I move on, and again, I'm going to get into all 5 of these I am going to get into all 5 of these. So if there's any questions, just let me know. Doesn't look like it. Great. So let's get into these 5 elements of what makes culturally nourishing instruction. So first thing you have to do, like we said, is acquire knowledge about the cultural diversity of your course and self-assess your own biases. So let's talk about diversity. This is similar to my culture question, but I do want to put that question up there. So please type in that same question box, in what ways are your learners diverse? Think about your own program, think about a class you've taught, think about a group of people you've worked with educationally, In what ways were they diverse? I see socioeconomic background, socioeconomic level of education, the degree of literacy that they have, economics against socioeconomics, age, ethnicity, parental status, how they dress, education levels, coming from different countries, age, the value they place on education and literacy, culture, language, age, expectations, levels of knowledge, diverse educational backgrounds, age, religion differences, customs, gender, great. So the moral of the story here, right, is that there's tons of ways learners are diverse. And I see that Sharon has them fill out a form that tells you how they're diverse. But I would caution against necessarily having that because learners are diverse in a lot of ways, right? We just saw people's backgrounds can mean a lot of different things. So when we're trying to figure out in what ways our learners are diverse, we have to consider so many different things. When you first sit down and think of diversity, and before we think, okay, well, now that we've sat here and talked about this for about 10 minutes and we've all been involved in education for a long time, but like take 5 seconds and you can type it in the box. You don't necessarily have to, but I'm sure we're all going to think the same thing. When we talk as a nation about diversity, what are we talking about? The first thing we talk about when we talk as a nation about diversity, race. Thank you, Joy. Race, I see a couple of data, thank you. Right, Dora, a lot of people are saying race because that's what people think when we think diversity, right? And so folks will often say, all right, well, I'm gonna make my course culturally responsive or culturally nourishing, culturally sustaining. I'm gonna throw a couple of authors who represent the group that my students are from, and I'm gonna say, great, I did it. I'm culturally sustaining because I have an African-American author, or I have a Latinx author, or I have a Muslim author in my course, and they're reading that book, so now I'm culturally sustaining. That's not true, right? Culturally sustaining means a lot of different things, and I see a lot of us are putting a lot of different answers, which is awesome. Culturally sustaining and culturally nourishing education is not just, okay, I'm just going to throw a book up there that represents my students. That's tokenism, and that's decidedly not doing this meaningfully. That's where a lot of schools do it wrong. And so how do you acquire this knowledge? How do you self-assess your own biases? I like to ask students, hey, how would you describe yourself? Because that will allow students to see how they describe themselves. Some students will go with their gender, some will say their nationality, some will say their race, some will say their religion, some will say how their education status, some will say they're a parent, but that tells you how they view themselves. And by knowing how they view themselves, that's going to help you educate them. And then we have to evaluate our own biases. And it's really hard to do. And I do want to, and I think Dora's suggestion, she asked them to teach them about themselves, which is really important, right? That helps. I just want to tell you a story about evaluating your own biases. And we're all going to have to do this differently because we all come from a different place. We all have a different starting point. But I am going to tell us a little bit about our own biases. And Karen, I'm going to talk about how I had to evaluate my own biases. So the Teachers Democracy Project here in Baltimore, and I don't know who's from Baltimore here, and that's fine. It's an organization that does a lot of advocacy around education. And when I was in K-12 education, I was one of 10 instructors asked to write a Black Lives Matter curriculum for the Black Lives Matter Week of Action. That was 2 school years ago. And because Baltimore City Public Schools wasn't doing it, so this other organization was going to do it. And I sat down to write a curriculum about the history of segregation in Baltimore City and how Baltimore City is still segregated and the impact of that on families and students. And so I write this curriculum, it's a week long. It's really great. I'm really excited about it. I talked to authors who have written about this thing, and there's really great resources in here. And it's all about how terrible it is that Baltimore City is segregated and how terrible the impacts are on the Black community. And the woman who I'm sitting next to, while we're talking about this, is writing a curriculum for middle school, and I was writing it for high school. Writing a curriculum for middle school, and her curriculum was called What's Good in the Hood. And her curriculum was all about, even though there's disparities for certain neighborhoods in Baltimore City, there's some really great stuff going on in these communities as well. And I was really knocked back because my own biases was like, yeah, well, my students and my experience, my students, they knew that they weren't getting equal treatment, and they knew that their communities were disinvested. And so why don't we just talk about it? But this person who I was sitting next to, who was writing this curriculum, grew up in Baltimore, born and raised, I believe, Northeast Baltimore, taught in West Baltimore, is now the president of the teachers union in Baltimore. And she said, well, the first thing that we have to do is tell our students about the positive, about where they come from, so that they grow, so that they can build some, build some self-concept. And I had to go back and totally change the first 3 days of my curriculum to be much more positive and talk about the positive history of these things, because I hadn't considered that, right? My own bias was that the disinvested areas of Baltimore are not treated equally. That is bad. Students know this. When I talked with someone who was from these regions and who was from these areas and who lived in these areas today, she's like, no, there's great things going on, and we need to tell the students the great things going on. And through that, I was able to adapt my curriculum and make it more culturally sustaining, more culturally nourishing for my students. Step 2 is to speak to your students, right? This is really straightforward. Once you've examined your own biases, you've thought about this sort of thing, you have to speak to our students. They are the best teachers about their own cultural diversity. They will tell you how they are diverse. And we talked about this a little bit. They will tell you how they are diverse. And that will make you able to create a curriculum that responds to them better. Then you use this knowledge to adjust your instructional practices. And we do this through something called cultural scaffold, using your students' experiences to figure out how you're going to help them structure knowledge. You need to know where their base is. You need to know where they start, right? Asking them about their experiences, figuring out how your students are diverse is really helpful in knowing where their base is. I didn't think to say, maybe my students really like where they live. And because I hadn't done that, I was assuming a base that was not correct. So take a minute and share in the question box. What adjustments could you make just off the bat? How could you make some adjustments to your instructional practices? And if you're sitting here thinking, well, these are how I think my students are diverse, base it off how you think your students are diverse at the moment. You haven't talked to them, you're not talking to them. We're all at a distance right now, and currently you're in a PD. But what adjustments could you make based on how you think your students are diverse to your instructional practices? This is kind of a hard question. So I see we're maybe learn about educational practices from their culture, from data, figure out how to adopt some of the educational practices from different cultures into the classroom. Karen's telling us her students are in a prison house. That's really different, right? But learning about their background might allow you to make some adjustments. And obviously there's a different degree of difficulty with what you can and can't bring into a prison environment for education. But learning about where they came from before that point might allow you to make some adjustments. I see Shauna saying allowing for more writing and discussion based on experiences rather than necessarily response to text. I love that with writing. I love free writing, even with adult learners, because writing is a muscle that a lot of folks have not really exercised. So allowing folks to write personal narratives, even though that's not the same type of writing, the literal practice of I'm thinking something and I'm writing something is really hard for a lot of our adult learners. And so having them practice that over and over again is really important. Marcus is telling me that that educational background is one way that they might be different, but Marcus, I'd be curious what adjustments you can make based on that. Leading questions to talk about what defines the students. Good. Adjusting class time. Interesting. Jeannie's talking about making sure that we're sticking to facts. Good. Dora telling a story about how she had a Q&A session in her classes because a student asked for it. Right, certain students like cooperative learning a lot better. Allow students to develop. Mr. Perty from my program telling me he's going to allow students to develop lessons and practices, which is awesome. So I really think it's valuable for a lot of our learners to have this empowerment to create their own things and do their own bits of their education, because a lot of our learners, and I'm talking specifically for my program, specifically the ABE part of my program, if students did not go through school and graduate a traditional high school, there is often a reason why. And a lot of those reasons are not the fault of our students. But a lot of our students haven't had a really educational experience that really values them. So showing them that you value their opinion and their input and their thoughts is a really empowering thing, both for their self-concept and for their growth. I see encouraging students between dialogue between students to help overcome bias they may have towards each other, which is really key and really hard. Open discussions. Patricia's talking about using Black authors from history to draw comparisons to Black authors today, which is awesome. And it's funny, I was talking when I give this presentation in Baltimore City, because Baltimore City folks tend to know a lot of the same Black authors in Baltimore City. What I will often say as an example of not being culturally nourishing is, okay, I'm an English teacher, I'm teaching RLA, GED classes, and for the reading, rather than reading, I don't know, Animal Farm, I grabbed the D. Watkins, and now we're reading D. Watkins, and now I've done it because it's an African-American author, right? But that's not actually value. That's not necessarily doing it. That's tokenizing, right? Throwing one Black author on the bookshelf isn't necessarily making a culturally nourishing curriculum. And the problem is that's where a lot of teachers stop, right? Learning about the ways in which your students learn and how they like to learn and what their interests are really valuable. And I'll throw in there, I see this is for ABE native English speakers, but acknowledging and appreciating students' non-standard speech style is really important as well. Good. I would also throw another thing, varying up the reading materials you're giving your students. If you're asking your students to read and answer questions and you're trying to get them to exercise that muscle of reading comprehension, giving multiple different opportunities for reading different topics. I really like Newsy LA. I used that when I was teaching high school, and it's really helpful for adult learners too. I would highly recommend, if you don't have experience in Newsy LA, check it out. They let you scale up and down the Lexile level, which is really helpful. And they also create questions. What you could do is have different readings for your classes, which will allow your students to pick based on interest. Because what we haven't suggested is diversity of thought. Different students just like different stuff, right? We haven't talked about diversity of thought really at all. But different students just like to do different stuff, and they have interest in different stuff. And so allowing your students to pick based on interest what they're reading is really important as well. It's a little more work for educators, but it really pays off in the classroom because you get more motivated students. And I see Karen suggesting White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, which is really great. I would also read How to Be an Anti-Racist. It's also a really good book for that sort of thing. Gwendolyn's asking, why can't it just be any author and let the students compare and contrast experience in their lives versus the experience in the book? They absolutely can. But a lot of teachers don't provide the opportunity for students to bring their own life into their work. So there's not one way to do this. And that's kind of the idea of this whole presentation. There's a lot of ways to do this. And as long as we hit the steps, you're going to do it correctly in your course, in your classroom, right? There's a lot of different ways to do it. We also need to recognize age as a culture, which I 100% guarantee and agree with Karen. So thank you, Karen, for sharing that. That's really important. Karen, I know this probably could be an hour, but we'll talk about this a little bit. So let's keep going. For low-level English learners, it's a little bit harder. What we've done in my program, Sharon asked, what about low-level English learners? In my program, what we've done, and what some of our instructors for low-level English learners have done, is I'll just have them talk, okay, what's education like in your country where you come from? Or what's education like in your cultural background? Let them talk about what their experiences were in education early on. And having them try to communicate that in English as best as possible back and forth, even at the low level, is really helpful. And then the teacher kind of scaffolds a little bit by helping translate on top of it. So let's keep going. So the next is to examine classroom materials. And we've talked about this a little bit, but I do want to throw this out there. So think about your own classroom materials. If you mostly teach social studies, you mostly teach English, if you mostly teach math, whatever you teach, what is a way you could add, what is a material, and this is different than the question that is on the thing, so listen to what I'm asking because it's different than what's on the screen. What is a material you can add that's just coming to mind, if something does come to mind, to your classroom curriculum that you could use with your learners, that you think would make your classroom more culturally nourishing? That's true, Sharon. They may not know the words in English. So what is something that's coming to mind that you could add to your classroom now that would make your classroom more culturally nourishing? Sharon, I see you have your hand up. I'm going to save questions for a little bit. We're almost at the end. We're going to save, so just hold on to your thoughts. If you have anything to type in the question box, I will throw it out there. Karen says the impacts of COVID-19 in the prison system, which is a really interesting thing to add to your classroom that can give them interest in the outside world and also allow them to read about their experiences. Adding student-suggested subject matter, good, Dora. Pictures of diverse learners is really important, Sharon. I would ask you to take it a step further, but I do think that is important. Presentations about countries or regions students are coming from Carolina, who is our ELA instructional specialist at the Adult Learning Center. Betsy's asked students to recount or retell a folk story from their country, which is really interesting. About the COVID on prison systems. Complete a cookbook with recipes from their country is really great. Materials and vocabulary pictures, really good. There's a lot of stuff here, right? And then once you've done this, you can implement, right? It's difficult and it's hard and you're gonna have to do some research and it's hard work. But once you've done this, you can implement and then we're good. So I do wanna open for some questions. I do wanna try to respect our time and we do only have about 5 minutes left. I can go a little bit over, I think, and Gina and Ellen can tell me if that's not the case. But if you have any questions, and I see a couple of other suggestions as well, publications that are student written, maps, and stuff like that. So Sharon has a question. Sharon, I'm going to unmute you. Sharon, you are unmuted. You can ask your question. Sharon going once. Sharon going twice.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, well, I'm concerned that sometimes with my students, low-level students, I mean, I know about their backgrounds and things, conditions in their countries, but for them to express, and when they're beginner students, and to express in English how they feel, what it was like there, I don't think I think they're either they're both embarrassed and have a hard time with the vocabulary. Very hard. And I mean, I could present the vocabulary, but it still would be hard. And what do you do about that?
So I would suggest, and I'm not an ELA person by trade, but I would suggest giving them a set of adjectives. And after you've taught the meaning of those adjectives, giving them the opportunity to pick a couple to describe memory from their home country. That might allow them, that kind of scaffolding might allow them to express themselves in a way that would be positive for them. Karen, I appreciate your request to ask me if you could observe one of my classes. I don't teach at the moment, but there are a couple people in my program who do some great work specifically with this. So my email, I believe they'll share my email and I'll kind of type it in the question box. I don't actually think that won't come up, but I'll put my email somewhere and you'll be able to see it there. There any other questions people might have? Well, I try to figure out if I could type my email on the screen or something. Will we get a copy of your presentation? I'm fine sending this presentation out. As long as Gina and Ellen are cool with it, I'm cool with it. Monica makes a really good point. It's important to remember that our student owns his or her own experience. It's not our job to fix things for them in the classroom environment. The frame of conversations will help students focus on what they want to talk about. And I will add that it's also important for us not to try to fix things for our students, but to allow our students to express themselves in the way that they want to, right? We're not fixing anybody. What we're doing is opening up the opportunity for them to express themselves. And I think actually there's a possibility. Is it on there already? Nope. I thought my email was on there, but it's not. Let me see if I can write it. It's not going to look good if I write it, but I'm going to try.
So I shared your email address in the chat box, so that should be sent out to everyone. And additionally, all the resources and recording of this session will be available on our website at the completion of the webinar. But if anybody has additional questions, Jesse's email is recorded there for you.
But I'm happy to hear other questions. We can go a little bit over if we need to. It's really not a big deal. I see Karen. So Dora tells us we give them tools to fix themselves, and I would challenge that a little bit because I don't want us to assume that our students need fixing at all, right? I don't think we want to come to the assumption that our students need fixing at all. While I agree that a lot of them want to grow, growing and fixing are not the same thing. So coming at our students with the mindset that they need to fix themselves can often manifest itself in a little bit of in a deficit thinking about our students. So I would challenge that a little bit. Betsy brings up a similar point to kind of what I'm getting at. Is it's important to look at the cultural differences as assets. Right? A lot of the time folks come with a deficit mindset and that's not the case. So Nona asked me to share some websites where we can get some ideas for lesson plans. What I will tell you is the Teachers Democracy Project put the Black Lives Matter Week of Action lessons, and these were meant for K-12, but a lot of them also apply. And I would recommend, especially if you're working either in Baltimore City or with a majority African-American population, to look for the Teachers Democracy Project Black Lives Matter Week of Action lessons. And if you Google it, and I'm going to type that in the chat, and if you Google it, it should come up. And I think mine is actually the first one that comes up.
Also, Jesse, and FYI, there's an organization called the Change Agent that the World Education ended up posting a lesson series with free lesson packets to discuss race in the classroom. And I'm going to go ahead and put that in the chat box for you too.
That'd be great. Thank you. So is there anybody else with a question that I could answer? There's a lot going on. There's a lot of information. I know that we said 10:30. I'm happy to go over a little bit if people do have questions. You can just type them in the box if you have them. But there are a number of points that we need to point out about this. And generally the idea is that it's hard to make a culturally nourishing classroom. It's easy to make a culturally responsive classroom. Culturally responsive is step one, right? To have a culturally nourishing classroom that nourishes where your students come from and really helps them grow in the ways that they want to grow, you need to take a couple more steps. And that's really what this presentation is about. So if there's no other questions, please, feel free to find me. If you have any questions, you have my email now. Thank you, everybody. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Jamie. I really appreciate your presentation today. And we see a lot of positive feedback in the question panel. But if everyone can take a moment, I just put a link in the chat box to our feedback survey just to give us formal feedback on how today's presentation went. This is our second institute and we do plan to grow from here. So any feedback we receive, we definitely take into account. And I see, Jesse, you're looking at the Facing Racism.
Yes, I am. I'm pulling that up right now so we can all take a look at it.
Yeah, absolutely. But thank you guys so much for participating. As I mentioned, the recordings will be available at a later date and also access to Jesse's PowerPoint. But thank you guys so much for your participation. This was fabulous and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, everybody.